Welcome back to the deep dive. You know, when we think about the 16th century, especially the Spanish arriving in the Americas, the big stories always seem to be about conquest.
Right. Cortez, Pizarro, these almost like unstoppable forces sweeping across empires. That's the headline anyway.
Exactly. It sounds so neat, so inevitable.
But when you dig into the sources, especially for the early settlements, the smaller outposts, it's a completely different picture. It's messy.
Messy how?
Well, it's defined by constant struggle, resistance, just sheer uncertainty. Survival wasn't a given. So today, we're really deep diving into that turbulence, that fragility.
Okay, so our mission isn't just recounting conquests, it's uncovering the contested reality, the constant pushback, the shaky authority, the human drama of just trying to stay there.
Precisely. It's about the periphery, the edges, where things were far less certain.
It's fascinating. So how are we going to explore this? What's the plan?
Well, we've got a few key examples lined up. We'll start with Cumana, one of the earliest really tough settlements. Then there's the mystery of Acacan. It's kind of a lost colony story before Roanoke.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Then Santa Elena in North America, which really highlights the geopolitical pressures. And finally, we'll look inwards at the conflicts within the Spanish system itself, the attempts at reform, and the backlash.
Okay, great roadmap. Let's jump in with Cumana then. Modern day Venezuela, right? Founded really early, like 1501.
That's the one. And you hear founded and think, okay, they set up shop. But the sources, they tell a different story.
How so?
It wasn't just founded once. Cumana had to be refounded multiple times over decades.
Wait, multiple refoundings? What does that actually mean on the ground?
It means failure, catastrophic failure usually. It means the initial settlement was likely destroyed or abandoned under duress, maybe wiped out entirely. They'd keep coming back and starting over from scratch.
Wow. So not exactly putting down firm roots. What was causing that constant cycle?
In a word, resistance. Continuous, organized indigenous resistance. The local groups simply did not accept the Spanish presence.
They fought back effectively.
Very effectively. Enough to dismantle whatever the Spanish built, push them out, make the whole venture collapse again and again. It really, it challenges that whole narrative of effortless Spanish dominance, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It establishes right away for you, the listener, that survival was the exception, maybe not the rule, at least in these early peripheral zones. It wasn't one big battle. It was constant grinding pressure.
Exactly. Colonial control often meant, just holding the immediate area around the fort. Anything beyond that was contested, dangerous territory. They were constantly just trying to keep things going.
Okay, so from that constant military struggle, let's pivot. You mentioned Acacan, a mystery, a sort of lost colony.
Yes, this one's really captivating. It's near the Chesapeake Bay area, Spanish Jesuit mission, short-lived around 1570. And it has all the echoes of Roanoke, but much earlier.
Before Roanoke. Okay, I'm intrigued. What makes it a mystery?
Well, the central figure is this man, Don Luis de Velasco.
Okay.
He wasn't Spanish. He is a Native American youth from that region. Taken to Spain around 1561, educated, baptized, fully immersed in Spanish culture.
Right, the idea being he'd be a bridge, a cultural go-between.
Precisely. He was meant to be the key. The Jesuits brought him back with them to Acacan, relying on him to smooth things over, help them establish the mission.
It didn't work out that way.
It didn't just not work, it seems to have imploded. The mission lasted only maybe 18 months, then it was found abandoned.
Abandoned how? Like everyone just left?
Worse. The accounts that followed, well, they're pretty grim. They suggest Don Luis turned on the Jesuits, abandoned them, went back to his native ways, and was allegedly involved in the violence that wiped out the mission.
Wow. So not just resistance, but a betrayal from the very person they trusted most, a complete failure of that cultural bridge strategy.
It really highlights the danger, doesn't it? They put all their faith in this one person, this cultural intermediary, miles from any real support.
When that trust broke,
the whole thing vanished. It shows how unpredictable these encounters were, how fragile these early footholds could be, especially when they relied more on, say, cultural diplomacy than actual force or numbers.
That's a stark lesson. Okay, let's shift geography again. You mentioned Santa Elena, southeastern U.S.
Right, present-day South Carolina. Founded in 1566. This was important strategically. Spain was trying to counter French interest in the area.
So a northern anchor for their claims, but following the theme, I'm guessing it wasn't smooth sailing?
Not at all. Same story, different place. Constant pressure, constant conflict with local tribes. Santa Elena was meant to be permanent, but it was always contested.
And just the logistics, right? Supporting a garrison that far north must have been a nightmare.
Oh, absolutely. The supply lines, the communication, it must have been incredibly draining, which of course made them vulnerable.
And did that vulnerability lead to a breaking point?
It did. In 1576, things really came to a head.
What happened?
A major attack. A coordinated effort by several tribes. The Arista, the Guale, the Escamacu, among others, they hit Santa Elena hard.
Successfully.
Very successfully. Overwhelmed the Spanish defenses. It was so bad that Spanish had to temporarily abandon the settlement.
Temporarily abandoned. There's that phrase again. It signals total failure, doesn't it? A forced retreat.
Exactly. They did come back, they rebuilt.
Yeah.
But the writing was kind of on the wall.
So what was the final outcome for Santa Elena?
Ultimately, Spain pulled the plug. In 1587, they decided to abandon it permanently.
Permanently. After all that effort, why give up a strategic spot like that?
It basically came down to cost versus benefit. Sustaining Santa Elena against constant indigenous hostility, the sheer drain on resources and manpower, it was just too much.
So they decided to consolidate.
Right. They pulled back, focused their resources on Florida, which was more established, though still facing its own challenges, mind you. But abandoning Santa Elena really shows the limits, the fragility of Spain's reach in North America at that time.
Okay, so we've seen external pressures, resistance, logistics, these cultural encounters gone wrong, but you mentioned the complexity wasn't just external, there were internal struggles too.
Yes, and this is where it gets incredibly complex. We need to talk about the divisions within the Spanish colonial system itself, specifically around how indigenous populations were treated or mistreated.
The morality and legality of it all. You're talking about things like the encomienda system.
Exactly. The encomienda. Can you briefly explain that for the listener? What was it and why was it so contentious?
Sure. So the encomienda system, in theory, granted Spanish settlers the encomendero's responsibility for groups of indigenous people. They were supposed to protect them, instruct them in Christianity.
That was the theory.
Right. The reality basically became a license for forced labor, often brutal forced labor in mines, on farms. It was systematic exploitation, rife with abuse.
And this didn't go unnoticed back in Spain or even among some colonists. There were figures pushing for reform.
Bartolomé de las Casas being the most famous, right? He really campaigned hard against the abuses.
Tirelessly. His work, and others like him, put immense moral pressure on the Spanish crown. And this pressure eventually led to significant legislation.
The new laws of 1542.
That's right, the new laws. A major attempt by the crown to rein things in.
What was the goal? To protect indigenous people, limit the settlers' power.
Both. They aimed to curb the worst abuses, regulate labor, and crucially, the plan was to phase out the encomienda system altogether over time. No new encomiendas and existing ones wouldn't be passed down through inheritance.
Okay, that sounds like a huge shift. A real attempt at reform from the top. Did it work? Did the encomenderos just accept it?
Far from it. This is where the internal conflict explodes. The settlers didn't see this as needed reform. They saw it as a direct attack on their livelihoods, their wealth, their entire way of life built on this labor.
So pushback.
Massive pushback. We're not talking about lobbying or petitions. We're talking about armed revolt.
Armed revolt. The Spanish colonists fighting against the Spanish crown's laws.
Precisely. The new laws sparked immediate violent uprisings by the encomenderos in the core territories, places like Peru and Mexico.
Not on the periphery, but in the heartlands.
Yes. In Peru, it escalated into a full-blown civil war. Settlers took up arms against the king's own viceroy, effectively fighting to maintain their right to exploit indigenous labor.
That's staggering. It completely changes the picture of Spanish control, doesn't it? The crown issues laws, but the guys on the ground with the guns just say no.
It really exposes the gap between theoretical authority in Madrid and the practical power held by local elites in the Americas. Who was really running the show?
It suggests the empire was maybe more fragile internally than we usually think, if your own colonists are willing to fight you over reforms.
Exactly. It shows how contested authority was, even among the colonizers themselves. The new laws were morally ambitious, perhaps, but enforcing them threatened to tear the colonies apart from within. The crown actually had to backtrack on some of the key provisions because the resistance was so fierce.
Wow. Okay. This deep dive has definitely shifted my perspective. It's not a simple story of conquest at all.
Not even close.
We've seen these settlements were constantly contested. There was fierce indigenous resistance, like in Cumana. There were these unique, dangerous cultural encounters like Exacan, strategic retreats like Santa Elena.
And then these huge internal fights over reform and exploitation, leading to actual civil war among the Spanish.
So when you put it all together, what's the big takeaway?
I think the main thing is that the traditional narrative of inevitable smooth conquest just doesn't hold up under scrutiny, especially in these earlier phases or on the edges. What emerges is far richer, more complex. It's about human drama, the limits of power, the immense challenges of distance and control, and deep, deep divisions.
It shows why so many of these early footholds were, well, temporary. They were fighting battles on multiple fronts externally and internally.
Exactly. Places like Santa Elena weren't just hard to hold against native groups, they were also perhaps politically difficult to justify supporting when the core territories were simmering with revolt potential.
And that actually leads perfectly into our final thought for you, the listener. We know the new laws caused revolts in Peru and Mexico, forcing the crown to dilute the reforms. So consider this. How much did that internal resistance, that constant threat from powerful encomenderos, angry about any limits on their power, influence the decision to abandon peripheral places like Santa Elena?
Was it just about the difficulty of holding the frontier? Or was it also about the crown needing to conserve resources and political capital to manage the descent within its supposedly loyal base? Did the need to appease powerful colonists elsewhere make distant, costly outposts like Santa Elena simply expendable?
Something to think about. What other reforms might have failed, not just because of logistics, but because the colonists themselves refused to comply? Lots to chew on there. Join us next time for another deep dive. Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we aren't just, summarizing history. We are strapping on our historical detective hats and diving into the deepest part of the archive. We're exploring daily life in the 16th century Spanish colonies.
Right.
But the key insight we're really looking for isn't just what happened, it's, how historians actually know this stuff by getting into the primary sources themselves.
Yeah, it's like the ultimate shortcut, really. Our mission for you, the listener, is to get beyond those general textbook summaries.
Okay.
We want you to see the actual, tangible documents.
Yeah.
The ones that reveal that tension right at the heart of the Spanish Empire.
What tension is that exactly?
Well, it's the conflict between the crown's grand vision, this idea of perfect order, and then the messy, often chaotic reality that people actually lived on the ground.
So we're talking about cutting through centuries of interpretation, getting right back to look at the source categories that really define this whole era.
Precisely. Everything from, say, intimate private letters to those cold, bureaucratic financial reports.
And those explosive moral critiques, too, the ones challenging the entire system.
Exactly. And when you layer these source types, all these different viewpoints, you start to build a much more nuanced view of early Spanish America.
Right.
It covers everything from governance and the economic demands right down to the sort of unspoken social pressures and even the internal religious struggles.
Okay, let's really unpack this. Where should we start? Maybe with the most vulnerable, the most immediate source we have.
Personal correspondence.
Oh, definitely.
Right, the letters and diaries.
Yeah.
If we want to understand the true texture of colonization, we have to start with what the settlers themselves were writing. This is the human side, right? The unfiltered view, often stripped of all that political pretense.
Oh, absolutely. These sources are invaluable. They provide the specific details that, broader history often just smooths over.
Like what kinds of detail?
Well, for instance, collections like the ones published in Letters and People of the Spanish Indies, that specific 16th century collection, they do more than just show who wrote to whom.
They reveal these immediate grinding concerns. Things like incredibly high mortality rates, the chronic shortage of basic European goods people expected.
Or just the outrageous cost of things we don't even think about now.
Exactly. That's where the abstraction just stops. It's the difference between reading, okay, there was a commodity shortage, and then reading an actual letter from a settler complaining that the price of, say, imported Spanish olive oil or wine has quadrupled in 6 months.
making daily life financially impossible, basically.
Utterly untenable.
Okay.
Or documenting the constant fear of endemic tropical disease. It's visceral.
Yeah.
And these personal accounts, they cover everything. Marriage arrangements, property disputes, just the sheer anxiety of trying to communicate across the Atlantic.
Which must have taken months.
Months.
Yeah.
Exactly. And they're critical because they contextualize the formal rules.
Yeah.
The official reports might mandate a certain type of production quota, for example.
Right.
But the letters, they show the massive gap between that decree on paper and the actual ability of a few struggling settlers, maybe racked by fever, to actually execute the order.
Okay, but here's a question then. If we as historians rely on these often, frantic, maybe sometimes hyperbolic complaints, how do we trust their objectivity? Isn't a personal letter sometimes just the disgruntled voice of someone whose venture failed? How do historians vet that kind of bias?
Well, that's a fundamental challenge, isn't it? And it really pushes us toward critical thinking. A historian can't just take one letter as gospel truth.
Right.
But when you find dozens of letters, maybe from geographically separate locations, and they all complain about the same specific shortage or the same administrative delay or the exact same exorbitant customs duty,
okay.
then a reliable pattern starts to emerge. You use the collective anxiety, that shared experience, not just the individual complaint, to reconstruct what that lived reality likely was.
That makes a lot of sense. So, okay, if the personal letters are like the fragmented whispers of individuals struggling to cope,
Yeah, good way to put it.
then we need to turn to the documents that were actually built to try and silence that chaos, to impose order, the formal records. So we're pivoting pretty dramatically now.
We are. From the whisper to the booming voice of the crown, you could say. These are the official reports, the colonial records, the internal administrative documents. This is the government's view, and it's focused relentlessly on efficiency, management, and this is crucial accountability back to Spain.
What's fascinating here, I think, is that the Spanish crown, maybe uniquely for its time, developed these highly standardized document types. They were designed to capture information in a very specific format. This is where it gets kind of technical, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And to understand the inherent bias in these sources, you have to understand the form itself. Like, consider two specific types: the Relation Geographica and the Residencia.
Okay, what were those?
So the Relation Geographica was essentially a standardized questionnaire. Often it included maps, and it was designed to survey the land, the native populations, the resources.
A survey?
Right. But it forced officials to record information in a specific way, often, frankly, an overly optimistic manner. They weren't just writing freely, they were filling out a state-mandated survey that basically required certain kinds of answers.
Got it. So they're prompted towards positive reporting. And the other one, the Residencia.
The Residencia. That was the mandatory judicial review required of high-ranking officials at the end of their term in office.
A performance review, essentially.
A very serious one, conducted on-site, involving collecting testimony from others. So every official knew, throughout their tenure, that their performance was under intense scrutiny.
Okay.
Therefore, the official reports they generated during their term on agriculture, on military readiness, on the progress of missions, were heavily shaped by the need to demonstrate competence and success, regardless of the actual outcome sometimes.
Right. So if you're trying to prove you ran a tight ship back in, say, Spanish Florida, your official report on agricultural output is going to emphasize the big harvest. And maybe conveniently leave out the part where half of it's spoiled on the docks waiting for ships that never arrived on time.
That's precisely the kind of organizational dissonance we find. For instance, those detailed reports coming out of Spanish Florida, while they're crucial for understanding governance structures, logistics, all that, they were inherently optimistic projections, often aimed at securing continued funding and military support from back home in the metropolis.
Makes sense.
They detail everything, from the necessary volume of grain needed to sustain the garrisons to very specific defensive military orders. You read these reports, and you might imagine this perfectly oiled machine running smoothly. Until you find the footnote, or you cross-reference it with another document, maybe a letter or a different kind of report, confirming that, whoops, the entire year's strategic supplies were lost because some bureaucrat over in Cuba mislabeled the shipment or it got delayed.
Wow. So this documentation clearly shows the organizational priorities, but maybe also the organizational lie the empire was telling itself.
I think that's fair. They wanted to know about native relations, sure, but primarily in the context of pacification and how to organize labor.
Right. Control.
And they wanted to know about agriculture, but mainly insofar as it financially supported the crown's ventures and the colonial establishment itself.
So these records provide the kind of skeletal framework of the colonial economy, the structure determining where people lived, what they ate, what they produced.
That's a good way to think about it. The skeleton, yes, they are absolutely essential, but we have to read them knowing they are documents of, let's say, aspiration and administrative self-justification, not necessarily always documents of pure reality.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me, because the system itself, it seems, generated its own voices of conflict and challenge.
It did.
So next we need to move to the sources that capture movement, travel, challenges, and crucially, that moral conflict. We're talking travel accounts and critical writings now?
Yes. The travel accounts and the expedition journals are vital. They help us understand the sheer physical reality of the colonial world, the geographic hurdles, the immense difficulty of establishing logistics across vast, often unknown territories.
What kind of things do they describe?
Well, these reports often describe indigenous political structures they encountered, complex geographic features way outside the main towns. They paint a picture of daily life that involved, constant vigilance, brutal physical labor just to survive and move around.
And then you introduce the most famous and maybe the most difficult conflict. The internal moral critique. The kind leveled by figures like Bartolomé de las Casas.
Las Casas, yes.
His writings didn't just expose abuses, did they? They fundamentally challenged the whole theological and legal legitimacy of the entire colonial project.
That's exactly right. Las Casas' written denunciations, like his famous short account of the destruction of the Indies, they aren't just angry letters thrown into the void. No, they are structured legal and theological arguments. They were presented directly, deliberately, to the highest levels of the Spanish government, even to the king.
Wow.
They reveal an internal conflict that often gets overlooked. The idea that the colonial system actually contained the seeds of its own dissent, rooted in ongoing attempt to define the very human status of indigenous peoples within a Catholic framework.
But the crown was so powerful. Why did these critiques even survive? Why weren't they just completely suppressed and buried?
That's a great question. It's partly because the Spanish legal and religious framework, complex as it was, actually allowed for and sometimes even necessitated this kind of internal debate.
Really? How so?
Well, Las Casas wasn't usually challenging the king's ultimate authority directly. He was challenging the methods and the morality being used to enforce that authority on the ground, often by appealing directly to established Catholic doctrine and Spanish law itself.
So he was using the system against itself, in a way.
In a way, yes. And his writings survived precisely because they became part of official legal and ecclesiastical proceedings. They were recorded, debated, responded to.
I see.
So they offer these crucial insights into the internal political life. They show that governance wasn't monolithic. It was constantly being negotiated between, say, raw economic necessity and debated moral theory. This gives us those necessary multiple perspectives that just shatter the idea of a single, unified colonial mindset.
Okay, so we've got this massive, really complex mosaic emerging. We have the private worries of individual settlers, the self-serving logistics detailed by military officials, the geographic challenges noted by explorers on the move, and then the searing moral condemnation coming from theologians within the system. So what does this all mean for someone trying to learn about 16th century life today? How are all these incredibly diverse materials, maps, judicial reviews, personal letters actually brought together?
Yeah, and that's where modern archival efforts really transform the learning process. To build that multi-dimensional view of early Spanish America, you have to synthesize these different elements. And digital accessibility is just key.
We're definitely no longer talking about dusty, difficult trips to the archive of the Indies in Seville for most people.
Exactly right. Institutions like, for example, the Library of Congress now provide these vast digital collections. They're focused specifically on 16th century Spanish and Portuguese exploration and colonization documents.
So what can someone access?
A learner today can access high-resolution images of official reports, incredible maps, personal letters, summaries of judicial proceedings, often directly from their web browser. It's amazing.
That kind of digital synthesis allows the learner essentially to act as their own historian, doesn't it? You can immediately compare, say, that highly organized, standardized map from a Relation Geographica with a rough, maybe highly emotional personal letter describing the very same territory written around the same time. You get that immediate tension, that contrast.
That's the collective value right there. By synthesizing all these types of materials, From the official organizational minutia down to the intimate religious practices maybe detailed in a private diary somewhere, the learner moves beyond just abstract historical summary.
Right.
You start to grasp the concrete details of daily struggle, daily organization, daily belief. It's no longer some monolithic history lesson. It feels more like a living debate, full of contradictions.
Fantastic. So just to quickly recap our journey here, we started with the raw emotion and the specific economic complaints found in private correspondence.
Yeah, the ground level.
Then we moved through the sort of self-justifying order that's detailed in the official reports, like those from Spanish Florida.
The view from the administration.
And we finished by considering that essential moral and social critique offered by figures who debated the colonial project from within, like Las Casas.
Right, the internal challenge.
So what's the big takeaway here?
Well, I think the key takeaway is that understanding this history fundamentally means understanding the difference between the intended rule, what the Crown wanted, what the reports claimed, and the actual lived experience and the moral struggles happening on the ground.
And both perspectives are essential.
Absolutely essential, because that lived experience, captured in letters or critiques, often directly contradicts the official record. You need both to see the whole picture.
Absolutely. And that leaves us, and leaves you, the listener, with this final provocative thought to maybe mull over. If the organizational realities, the governance, the economy, were so thoroughly documented and standardized through those official records, how much of our understanding of 16th century colonial values, the ethical debates, the human costs, the internal conflicts that really defined the era, how much of that understanding is uniquely reliant on the specific, often dissenting, personal writings and moral critiques preserved, sometimes almost accidentally, in those very same archives?
It really makes you think, doesn't it? Where does the true historical voice actually lie? Is it in the official decree or the desperate letter, or somewhere in the tension between them?
If you opened a history book, maybe even one from 50 years ago, you probably got a very clean version of the Spanish conquest of the Americas. Columbus lands, Cortez marches, Pizarro conquers, sort of like a checklist. The narrative was essentially fast, brutal, and almost inevitable.
That's the story most of us got, right? Simple cause and effect.
But that narrative, the one where indigenous peoples were just, overwhelmed by technology or disease leading to this clean sweep, it's such a profound historical shortcut. It misses the real story.
Completely misses it.
It just erases the fierce, widespread, and this is key sustained pushback that really defined the first century of colonization. So today we're doing a deep dive into the sources that detail this constant state of, conflict, war, really. Our mission is to uncover those specific 16th century confrontations, the surprising strategies, and these stories of resilience that show colonial control wasn't a given. It was intensely challenged every step of the way.
Absolutely. It forced the Spanish to negotiate, to retreat sometimes, and definitely to adapt. And that's the crucial context we need to set for you right now. This indigenous opposition, it wasn't some sudden reaction or just a temporary bother for the Spanish. No, it was a constant, enduring feature of colonial expansion right from the very beginning.
From day one.
Pretty much. The Spanish were never truly operating in this vacuum of power people imagine. They faced organized enemies, people who learned, adapted, and fought back for generations.
And the surprising part, I think, for many people is just how quickly this started. We're not talking decades later. It's immediate military-grade pushback.
Right.
Okay, let's unpack this. Starting literally right after Columbus's first voyage in 1492, we should probably look first at the Greater Antilles.
The Greater Antilles, for context, that's the larger Caribbean islands. Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, Cuba. And the earliest, maybe the most striking example of organized defiance involves the Taino people in Hispaniola.
Ah, yes.
And this really sets the tone. It proves the indigenous response was immediate and it was violent.
Exactly. The sources detail this specific incident in 1493, and it completely contradicts that myth of the, awestruck, passive native population. After Columbus left a small settlement, La Navidad, the very first Spanish foothold, remember?
The first one.
The Taino people, led by a chief named Caonabo, they completely destroyed it, killed every single Spanish colonist left behind.
Think about that date, 1493. Within a year of contact, the very first Spanish settlement is just wiped out.
Gone.
It wasn't passive acceptance. It was a direct military response to invasion. The Spanish had to basically restart their whole colonization effort on Hispaniola after that. A major setback.
And what's fascinating, looking at the sources, is that this wasn't just a one-off event, right? Not just a single act of rage.
Not at all.
It marked the beginning of over 20 years of intense Taino resistance across the Greater Antilles. They kept that conflict going despite facing, well, huge disadvantages in weaponry.
Yes, definitely. Look at the Taino Rebellion in Puerto Rico. That ran from 1511 to 1518. Continuous fighting. The fact that the Spanish had to pour so much time, resources, military might over 2 decades just to subdue these initial island populations, well, it shows the extraordinary tenacity of their opposition.
Especially against a technologically superior foe.
Exactly. They truly fought for every inch before the Spanish gained anything like stable control.
That sustained effort in the Caribbean must have forced Spain to spend resources they probably assumed would be free for, further expansion elsewhere.
Oh, it was a massive early drain, no question.
Okay, so moving beyond the Caribbean now into North America, specifically Mexico. Here, the resistance seems to diversify, both geographically and tactically.
Yeah, the sheer scale of the Spanish attempt to control what they called Nueva España, New Spain, meant the conflicts here weren't just about, say, the collapse of big empires like the Aztecs. It was also these long, drawn-out territorial struggles with countless distinct peoples.
Right. Like, for instance, in Nueva Galicia, that's Western Mexico, you have the Mixtin War, raging from 1540 to 1542. This involved the Caxcanes and their allies engaging in really fierce, prolonged conventional warfare against Spanish control.
And then further south, you had the Mayans launching the Cupel Uprising shortly after that, 1546 to 1547.
That's were huge localized efforts. They must have required massive Spanish military mobilization to counter.
They did, but here's where it gets, I think, really interesting when we talk military strategy and adaptation. You have to look at the Chichimecas.
Ah, the Chichimeca War.
Yes. Their struggle began around 1550, and it was sustained for 40 years. 40. In the huge northern territories of Mexico.
Yeah.
And what's key is they realized, probably very quickly, that trying to meet the Spanish army head-on, field of battle style, it was just too costly.
Because direct confrontation meant facing those Spanish strengths, the steel weapons, the armor, and critically the cavalry. Horses were a game changer.
Precisely. You just don't beat a fully armored soldier on horseback head-on if you don't have similar tech. So the Chichimecas adapted. They adopted what we now call guerrilla warfare.
Okay.
Sustained ambushes, raids, avoiding those big decisive battles, but constantly hitting Spanish weaknesses.
Like supply lines.
Exactly. Supply lines, mining operations, small isolated settlements, things they could hit and then melt away.
They basically taught the Spanish a painful lesson in asymmetric warfare, didn't they? Like a 16th century version of fighting a superpower with 1,000 cuts, constantly bleeding resources, undermining confidence.
That's a good way to put it. And this strategy, it wasn't just annoying for the Spanish, it fundamentally changed the power dynamic up there. Spain had to dedicate enormous, continuous resources, soldiers, funding, supplies, for 4 decades. 40 years, without achieving a clear win.
So what was the end result? After 40 years of this strategic attrition, this refusal to fight a conventional war, did the Spanish finally crush them militarily?
Far from it. This constant pressure, this bleeding, it led the Spanish to the negotiating table.
Really?
Yes. By 1590, the Spanish were basically compelled to negotiate a large-scale, formal peace agreement, not achieve outright military victory.
Wait, hold on. So the supposed conquerors of a continent were forced to negotiate terms with an indigenous group they've been fighting for 40 years.
Absolutely. They essentially had to admit, maybe not explicitly, but implicitly, that the cost of continuing the war was higher than the cost of making peace. And this just underscores a critical point. Colonial control in this huge region was severely challenged. It wasn't absolute. The Spanish had to rely on diplomacy, concessions, not just brute force, to finally end the conflict and secure their northern frontier.
That is a phenomenal example. Strategic adaptation leading to a real political outcome. But if you want maybe the clearest, most undeniable example of successful, sustained resistance leading to formal political recognition, established borders even, you have to look south, right? To Chile.
Chile. This is where we talk about the Mapuche people. Their resistance during what's called the War of Arauco. And this wasn't a quick fight either. We're talking centuries. Continuous warfare starting in the 16th century, extending well into the 19th.
Incredible. And we specifically see figures like the war chief Lautaro. The sources mention he actually learned Spanish military tactics while he was held captive.
Yes, and then used that knowledge against them. He led incredibly successful campaigns, showing the staggering capacity for military adaptation and command.
Wow.
The Mapuche just proved incredibly difficult, maybe impossible, to defeat militarily. They forced the Spanish to repeatedly withdraw, rebuild garrisons. It was a constant struggle, and their resistance was so formidable, so sustained, it compelled Spain to do something really extraordinary for the time.
Which was?
Recognize indigenous sovereignty in formal peace negotiations.
Okay, so this isn't just a truce, like a temporary ceasefire. This sounds more like a constitutional moment in colonial history. What was the key event?
The key event, based on our sources, is the Parlamento de Colonial in 1641. A parlamento here means like a formal parliament, a great treaty negotiation. And this act explicitly detailed a diplomatic agreement. It acknowledged the territorial boundary, essentially, the border of independent Mapuche lands.
So a 17th century European superpower, Spain, signs a document explicitly accepting the territory and political integrity of an indigenous power. That completely flips the usual conquest narrative.
It really does. It's hard to overstate the significance.
Yeah.
It demonstrates the very real limits of colonial power when faced with determined, coordinated, and adaptable opposition. The Spanish crown basically recognized they couldn't conquer the Mapuche militarily, so they chose to manage the relationship through diplomacy, acknowledging the Mapuche as this persistent, sovereign political entity. That recognition is a powerful testament to their long-term military success.
Okay, so we focused a lot on organized military resistance, which is obviously vital, but it's also really important, isn't it, to see resistance as more than just fighting on a battlefield?
Absolutely. We have to broaden our definition of defiance here.
Because while those military conflicts were huge, there were so many other tactics, diverse tactics, used to resist the imposition of the whole colonial system.
Definitely. And the sources list several crucial non-armed forms of resistance. These had massive economic and political impacts too.
One powerful tactic was simply flight,
Yep.
just leaving Spanish settlements.
And that was tremendously effective. Why? Because the entire Spanish colonial system was built on extracting labor and tribute from indigenous populations.
Right, the encomienda system and similar structure.
Exactly. So when indigenous peoples fled Spanish settlements, moved into uncolonized areas, maybe joined other independent groups, they were actively denying Spain its most essential resource, its workforce. It created enormous administrative headaches and economic chaos for the colonial structure.
You also see the quieter, but maybe just as tenacious, refusal to acculturate, holding on to language, traditions, spiritual beliefs, directly opposing conversion and assimilation efforts. That cultural persistence really undermined the whole spiritual justification for the conquest, didn't it?
It absolutely did. And perhaps most strategically, you see the constant forming of alliances across different indigenous groups, pooling resources, pooling strength to challenge colonial authority. Spain was almost always fighting coalitions, not just isolated groups.
Which brings us to a crucial point about the Spanish military structure itself. The sources really emphasize this. The Spanish knew their own limitations.
They were acutely aware.
And they often relied, sometimes entirely, on indigenous allies. Those groups who sided with the newcomers, maybe due to old rivalries, maybe political coercion, whatever the reason, the Spanish needed them.
That fact alone is definitive proof that the conquest was provisional, highly contested, not absolute domination. If the Spanish couldn't operate without these complex internal alliances, they were reliant on a constantly shifting balance of power, not some inherent dominance. They were only as strong as their local partnerships allowed them to be.
And we can't really separate this discussion from the wider system of colonial oppression, which obviously included the enslavement of Africans brought over by the Spanish and Portuguese.
No, you absolutely can't. The sources highlight this continuous intersectional resistance. Enslaved Africans and indigenous peoples working together, resisting together throughout the 16th century and beyond.
How did that manifest?
Well, it included coordinated rebellions, small-scale guerrilla warfare, similar tactics sometimes, and significantly, the formation of what were known as maroon communities.
Palenques or Colombos, depending on the region.
Exactly. These were settlements, often in remote, hard-to-reach areas, founded by runaway enslaved people, frequently joined by indigenous allies who had also escaped colonial control.
So these maroon communities were essentially creating their own parallel, independent political structures right on the edges of the Spanish Empire.
Precisely. They were alternative societies based on freedom. And they were constantly draining Spanish resources because the colonial powers had to expend manpower just trying to recapture people, maintain the status quo, retrieve that lost labor. This constant, often unified front was always challenging Spanish domination from multiple angles.
So if you take one thing away from this deep dive today, it should probably be this. The accounts we have from the Taíno, the Chichimecas, the Mapuche, and countless others, they don't reveal submission. They show sophisticated strategic resistance, incredibly rapid adaptation, and a sustained decades-long, sometimes centuries-long challenge to colonial expansion. That standard conquest narrative. It really needs a serious rewrite to include these vital, undeniable stories of confrontation, political negotiation, and ultimately survival.
And maybe, connecting this to the bigger picture, it raises an important question for you, the listener, to think about. How do these long-term diplomatic settlements, this explicit recognition of indigenous sovereignty, like the Parlamento de Quilín in 1641 we discussed, how does that shape our modern understanding of colonial power? You know, when the supposed conqueror is forced to negotiate a formal treaty, forced to accept fixed borders, who truly holds the long-term strategic persistence in that picture?
That's a great question. Something to definitely mull over as you reconsider those early history lessons. Thank you for diving deep with us today.
Until next time.